Hi, everyone. This is Patrick Scullin. I'm a professor of graphic design and printing graphics at Riverside City College in Riverside, California. And I'd like to share with you guys some ideas on typography and graphic design. So, this is specifically directed at those graphic communications and advertising design students that might be looking for ways to improve what they do, because being able to design with type is essential. All right, so here we go. So, typography is the art of type design, not only how it looks, but how it's used. And it's necessary for us to be able to make effective communication. And so, my first tip for you guys is to think about the fact that type is meant to communicate, literally and figuratively. So, for example, in book design, number one, the most important thing to do is that your type is legible so you can actually read it and read the story. But more than that, the type design is an important aspect of the art of the book and how it looks and how it feels. And so here you have kind of a book design for Treasure Island. Again, it's about the story, but it's also about the time frame. When does it what is the mood? What is the style of the story that's being told? This also goes into, modern forms of printing, like, magazines or other things like that, where you're trying to tell the story of the article but also convey the information. So it really needs to communicate both visually and stylistically. Another thing you can think about is, how does type communicate what it is? So using a unique font, a style of font, putting that together with graphics, that tells a story as well, and it communicates what you're selling or what you're telling. Another important thing that I like to borrow from David Carson is this idea that you shouldn't mistake legibility for communication. And so that means that just because you can read it doesn't necessarily mean that the message that's being conveyed is the correct one. Sometimes that message that we convey is just as important, and it's done through stylistic things that you can and can't control. So while this isn't entirely legible, it does convey a style and a meaning. And so it says, interesting, clever, creative. It's flashy, so it catches your attention. And it says design. So that's a message that's conveyed subliminally, not necessarily literally being able to read the type, but it says something to us intuitively. Next thing, aside from just being able to communicate, is your type should be logical, right? Think Mr. Spock. We really need to be logical. It needs to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then it's not doing its job. And this is very simply, is it organized? Is it put together in a structure that makes sense that the reader can follow? Is the information visible and available to us as we go through it? Also, another cool aspect of design and type is, you know, could it really convey the message? And literally, in this case, is it logical enough that people could follow it so they don't get lost? This kind of organization and structure is integral to what you do as a designer, and making sure that people can read it and understand it. At the same time, we've got this competing idea with Captain Kirk, where it's all about feeling and emotion. So not only should type be logical, it should also be a little bit emotional. Be bold. Be willing to take things to the next level. Push them a little bit so they're not boring, because sometimes logical can be boring. And we want to avoid that. So be willing to invoke a little bit of emotion in what you do. To do that, the next step is use hierarchy. So, what does that mean? That means that you select things of particular interest and you make those the most prominent. You make those the most important. So, maybe it's done through color, maybe it's done through size and scale, but you arrange them so that people are attracted to them first. And so they know what to look at. It makes it comfortable, it makes the design make sense. It's another form of organization. But use hierarchy. It also makes things look visually interesting. And so play around with a variety of things as you're building a layout. Sometimes, if you need to make an adjustment and your design is a little boring or hard to follow, adjust scale. Pick the thing that's the most important and make it larger. Or another one is contrast. Isolate things from other things. whether with color or design or layout, so that they stand out in a unique way. Or like it says here, play around with direction, position. These are all interesting ways to try to play around with hierarchy in unique ways. Another thing you could do is play with color and style. I love the hierarchy of this sample where not only uh, is the text layout logical, it also plays with color and contrast. So on the one side, you have this bold, dark area. On the other, you have a nice light column. The color contrast is nice and easy to see. And then there's these interesting graphics that kind of capture your attention. So in terms of hierarchy, even though you have this image that really grabs your attention, you've also got kind of a nice little subtle button here. It says contact me on the side, um, that's balanced by the title that's in yellow. I mean, all of these things are kind of working together to grab your attention, but then give you a comfortable experience as you look through the design and decide where to go next. Here's another example where really playing around with simplicity really helps, where you have a nice dark background with a very subtle image. And then in the side, you have bold graphics that grab your attention, playing around with white and yellow. But then also the hierarchy and the scale and size of the letters really helps you know where to look and what to read. And it emphasizes in a subtle way, but bold way, that visual, that word visual grabs your attention. And so this is another form of that logic where you can look around, you know where to look and know what to do next. Be trendy. Now, I don't mean follow the trend, but I mean be aware of the trend. Know what people are doing today and not follow, but uh, but be inspired by it. Here's kind of a little cliche, this is what a hipster graphic designer needs to look like. No, it isn't. I'm not telling you all to buy the same shoes or get the same haircut. I'm saying that you want to pay attention to what's out there so that you know what people like, what the audience likes, so that you can kind of play along. Now, back in the day, it was all about the style of the letters. This cool classical vintage type from the Victorian era, really elaborate, beautiful type. And if you ever want to, go down a rabbit hole, start looking at Victorian type. It's very interesting. But here's an example where maybe you can borrow from a style in the past and bring it forward into our day and play around with it. That's a lot of time what designers will do is they'll look at the past for inspiration and then they'll bring it forward and they'll enhance it and revitalize it. That's what artists have done for centuries. And so designers are no different. So here's an example where they took kind of that Victorian flourish, but then applied it to a modern type design. And here's another example of maybe taking that vintage style, but playing around with it and updating it for our day, and using that style of symmetrical letters, kind of a dimension shadow effect. Very interesting. Of course, there's some trends that remind us of certain decades. This one makes me think of the '70s, and everything that's interesting in society, comes around again. So whether it's in fashion or television or whatever, we start seeing repeats, right? And so pay attention to that, and you might be able to pull something from it to make your design better. Here's a really hipster 80s style, right? Style is the key word. Have your own style too. Have a little bit of a flair. Be willing to push things a little bit further to make them stand out. What does that mean? It means don't use Comic Sans. Don't do it. Avoid Times New Roman. Boring. Times New Roman says boring. Papyrus, don't ever use it. That's like scratching on a chalkboard, right? It visually assaults your eyes. You don't want to use papyrus. And you especially don't want to use comic papyrus. That's like, you do that and, you nuke the whole thing. Instead, look for unique fonts that say something. Maybe it doesn't have an obvious connection to your project, but it actually has a style of its own that looks unique and interesting. A nice soft sans serif font. What is that good for? What could you use it on? Or maybe this more angular font has a more, modern feel that could be used for a certain type of project. This is kind of the fun part of type design, is figuring out what font style fits the project. Now, you don't want to go crazy and waste too much time looking around for the perfect font, because that's definitely a rabbit hole that will take your attention. But, you know, maybe have a list of your favorites. I tend to do that. I have a dozen or so fonts that I just use a lot, and everybody kind of has their favorites. Also, little unique things, little personality traits really make all the difference in fonts. So just having those little broken pieces in the N's and the T just make that unique. Otherwise, it'd just be kind of an average sans serif font. But those little broken parts, and then they call the font Connect. Irony. And then last but not least, I'm a sucker for handwritten fonts. And it's kind of cool nowadays to see handwritten type coming back into the computer. For the longest time, typography was controlled by computer programmers, and it was whatever they decided to put into the computer. But now, with our tools and all the graphics we have at our fingertips, we can bring in handwritten type. And it's not even a bad idea to do your own handwritten type, digitize it, vectorize it, and use it in a project. That always makes something look special and unique. So those little tricks will make all the difference and can really sell your design and really connect with an audience in a way that's better and is unique. All right, you guys. So those are some of my tips on how to improve your design, how to improve your typography, and use them wisely. Communicate, be logical, follow trends, not entirely, but be trendy, and then have some style. All right. So thanks for listening. Hope that helps. Take care, you guys.